All right, so first question, is paleo-inerrancy discredited by its contingency upon outdated Scottish realism? All right, now I'm part Scottish, so I can use this picture. If you're not Scottish, you can't use it. I have the hat to prove it. So here's kind of what's being suggested in that idea. So you have a philosopher named Thomas Reid. He was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. He was an empiricist, much like David Hume, only he put a little twist on his empiricism. He added realism to it and actually gave an antidote to the skepticism of David Hume. So because of that, Scottish Common Sense Realism became popular in certain segments of both Scotland and in the United States. In the United States, especially among the Presbyterians, because of their Scottish background. You have the Scottish Calvinists. So, and that's where the Princeton fits in. Princeton was a Presbyterian divinity school to begin with. And so we'll talk about the Old Princeton versus the New Princeton. The Old Princeton, supposedly, as this objection goes, absorbed a lot of Thomas Reid's philosophy and or Scottish Common Sense Realism, which I think is at least partially true. I'll grant that. Now they would say, okay, so that came in through the Old-Princetonians with Witherspoon, Warfield, Machen, Hodges, and then over time that goes through Presbyterians and also Thomists, which have maybe a different form of realism, not necessarily Scottish, more of the Thomas Aquinas kind of realism.
Not the Thomas Reid kind.
Right, yeah, but you know, a close cousin perhaps. So, and then some examples would be Dr. Geisler and Dr. Sproul. Sproul, of course, being on the Presbyterian side, Dr. Geisler not, but Dr. Geisler is a Thomist, so he does subscribe to a form of realism, and I think has some admiration for Scottish Common Sense Realism. So they would say, all right, this philosophy, this root of philosophy bears some theological fruit in the corpus of the ICBI. Now, when this objection, and I know it doesn't sound like an objection yet, I'll draw that out. When this objection comes up, they don't really break it down in a logical syllogism. So I attempted to do that. For you staunch logicians, don't expect the syllogism to be perfect, but I gave an attempt at it. So here's kind of how the argument goes. The Old-Princetonian bibliology, you know, their philosophy and methodology of what to do with the Bible, we're talking mainly infallibility, inerrancy, and, you know, a little hermeneutic, all that into bibliology. From the 1800s to the 1920s was contingent upon Scottish Common Sense Realism. Number two, the philosophy of Scottish realism, sorry for the typo, proved problematic over time. It's outdated, it's debunked, it's nobody subscribes to that anymore. You know, that we've gone past that. We've evolved past all that stuff. Therefore, the Old-Princetonian bibliology is contingent upon an outdated and debunked philosophy. ICBI is also therefore contingent upon Old-Princetonian bibliology and therefore debunked philosophy. And now, sorry, I know this isn't a tight syllogism here, but there's kind of two ways this argument plays out when it's voiced as an objection. And it can go one of two ways, or it can go both ways. One is that, hey, this proves that your concept of inerrancy is an innovation in church history. It was just invented by the Princetonians. You know, before the Princetonians, it never really showed up. So that's one way this objection will manifest itself. Yeah, so invented in Old Princeton and then trickles down through guys like Sproul and Geisler into ICBI. Therefore, you should discard it, just because it's an innovation. Alternatively, one way it could be stated is, so that high view of inerrancy that comes out of Old Princeton, it's polluted by rationalism. So it needs to be discarded because it's been tainted. Now, who says this? Quite a few people. Like I said, this argument gets recycled here and there. Semini's Ernest Sandine, who's surprisingly influential, he still gets quoted a lot today. I think there's actually some flaws in his view of history, which I won't get into. 1979, throughout some of the other workshops and plenary sessions, you've heard about Rodgers and McKim and their proposal. That was in 79. Also, Donald Lesh, he purports the same view, independent of Rodgers and McKim. More recently, Alistair McGrath, actually in 1996. He has his own spin on the same basic thing. Mark Knoll, very influential as a evangelical historian, and fairly recently Daniel Wallace as well, 2006. And this is just a minor sampling. I was actually just reading a book 2 days ago. It was John Hanna's book, Uncommon Union, subtitled The Relationship of Dallas Seminary to Evangelicalism. And he actually, John Hanna, pretty much paints the same picture. Now, he doesn't do it to say inerrancy is bad. What he does is he says, oh, that Scottish Common Sense Rationalism that came through the Presbyterian line, came through Old Princeton, it gets into old school Dallas Seminary. He's like, Louis Sperry Chafer, he absorbed all that stuff unknowingly, and that's bad. Well, he doesn't use it against inerrancy per se, but you get variations of this. So it's actually more popular than you might think. Daniel Wallace, his came from a blog called My Take Inerrancy at Bible.org, which is a pretty popular, influential website. All right, so my responses. And there could be many, many responses to this. Here's just a few that come to mind. One is, they're wrong. This view of inerrancy definitely predates Scottish realism. And the guy who really did a good job of proving that is John Woodbridge in his book, Biblical Authority. This was actually a response to the Rodgers and McKim proposal in 1982. He took it to task. He goes through church history. He's very good at church history and says, look, this is not an innovation. This view of inerrancy, high bibliology, definitely predates it. All right, now some people argue that, well, yes, the influence was there, but it was negligible. Maybe, maybe not. Personally, I kind of like the idea that it was a substantial influence. Not that it determines everything. But anyway, there are some people who have looked at it and said, no, it wasn't even, it was there, but it wasn't a big deal at all. Common sense realism, that is. It's a possible answer. All right, here's an interesting one. Independently of the Old-Princetonians, the Dutch Calvinists seem to have come up with basically the same bibliology. Now, why is that? To me, that's a proof that there's like a common evolutionary ancestor. Now, I don't think organisms have common evolutionary ancestors, but I think traditions and certain ideas definitely have common ancestors. I think this is just a proof that the Dutch Calvinists and the Scottish Calvinists are both drawing from an older tradition. I think this helps prove Woodbridge's point. All right, another response is, hey, maybe realism isn't such a bad idea. Whether it's Scottish realism or some other form of realism, more Thomistic kind, or what about this? What if there's a Hebrew realism that just underpins the entire Old Testament and New Testament? Hey, maybe realism is the standard that a lot of people operated on until you get things like Buddhism or Ammonius Saccas coming from India to Greece and introducing some thought into Greek thought, or until you start doing mushrooms and your mind is messed up or something like that. I don't know. So I would say one thing about realism is that it seems to be an antidote to skepticism. And some people object to realism, especially Scottish realism, saying, oh, it can't be true, it's too optimistic, it's not skeptical enough, therefore I don't like it, it's not true, because we know we should be skeptical about everything. To me that just kind of shows maybe some prejudices. So I'd say, hey, take a look at Scottish realism. I actually had to look up realism. Here's a quote by Norman Geisler. Just wanted to focus on this. It frees ministers from skeptical doubt. And he says that's one of the reasons it became popular in Presbyterian churches and or American churches. All right, and I think really an important clarification here is to say, look, the Old-Princetonians, they didn't invent this. They inherited it, but they took it to a new level. They saw themselves as apologists. They were defending the Bible, especially during the fundamentalist modernist controversy. And they saw this as extremely important for the health of the church, especially the Presbyterian church in America. So as apologists, they were forced by their critics, by their opponents, to elaborate, make it more sophisticated. I would say it's probably safe to say they developed it, they did not invent it. Another response is, okay, so let's say you reject realism, just for the sake of argument. It's bad. Let's get rid of it. Let's root it out. Well, what are you left with? Those who tend to say that, hey, common sense realism, it underpins your doctrine of inerrancy and it's bad, therefore your doctrine of inerrancy is bad. Okay, well, what are you going to do about it? They almost seem like they're so ignorant of philosophy that they think you can just, okay, get rid of that philosophy and operate in a neutral, like a philosophically neutral mindset. But you can't do that. You can't operate in a vacuum. You will have some philosophy or philosophies that underpin the way you think, your epistemology. And it, of course, will affect your hermeneutic and your methodology for understanding the Bible. And they don't seem to get that. So my question is, if you reject realism, what are you operating on in its place? I don't think they've thought that through very much. Here is, I think there's a hint here. This is a historian, Bruce Kuklick. This is published by Yale University, or Yale Press in 1985. This is from a book called Churchmen and Philosophers, From Jonathan Edwards to John Dewey, the Pragmatist. So he traces the history of thought in, especially church thought, and its philosophical roots in New England. And I'm just going to hit some highlights of this. He mentions Scottish realism in the college. And then from the late 18th, early 19th centuries, Americans ignored German speculation. So they were actively saying, no, we don't want that stuff imported from Germany. Again, an answer to the skeptical empiricism of David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment. Maybe that's a good thing. Anyway, bottom line is, he says it's shifted. There was a shift in New England thinking in the divinity schools and the colleges and pretty much everything academic. Now this is a chart that Dr. Geisler made. I made it years and years ago. I actually first came across it in 1997 and thought, wow, suddenly things are making a lot of sense. I don't know if you can see it very well or not, but it's kind of chronologically. The past is here, and going forward in time, you've got Aristotle and Plato, empiricism and rationalism. You've got these two streams of thought, and they are totally independent of each other. They're kind of antitheses of each other, and then Kant grabs them both. Doesn't synthesize them in a Hegelian sense, but he somehow, the way I would say it is he takes the worst of both. He takes the worst of rationalism and the worst of empiricism, puts it together, and creates kind of a Copernican shift in epistemology that the rest of us have to live with. And this is, this is Enlightenment stuff. I mean, we are dealing with this. So you see the colors change. The red kind of turns to a reddish blue. The blue kind of turns into a reddish blue. But one thing I want to point out is, look, there's another stream that comes out of Aristotle. And this is what Geisler wrote. Common Sense Realism, Thomas Reid. Here he puts Thomas Aquinas, and he traces it over to neo-theism. Sorry, thank you. Let me correct myself. Not neo-theism, neo-Thomism. Big difference. Thank you. He mentions Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain. So, in his scheme of, and by the way, this chart comes from Dr. Geisler's book, History of Western Philosophy, Volume 2, at Bastion Books. And he's been using it in his lectures for years. So, assuming this chart is accurate, good, helpful, we're dealing with the aftermath of Neo-Kantian thought. And I would say, look, if you are operating on some kind of realism, and you decide, hey, I don't want to do that anymore, what are you left with? You're going to have something Neo-Kantian, I suspect. And to those who propose this objection, I would say, look, again, you can't do theology in a vacuum. You have philosophical roots and theological fruits. So make your choice, but make your choice wisely. Personally, I would much rather go with the realism strain, which is not skeptical. It's actually kind of optimistic that you can know truth. Kant, on the other hand, anything past that, you can't know anything, is kind of the way that goes. All right, so I'm trying to wrap this point up. Is it under the influence of outdated Scottish realism? I think probably it's got a little influence, directly or indirectly. It's probably a significant influence. And I think, yes, I think the ICBI corpus does inherit a lot of that realism. And I think it's a good thing.